you have your, so you're plugging in your device now?
Yeah, I just put it in airplane mode in case me or sends me a text message, you know. Started yet?
The stream is starting.
Okay.
Let me
know when it's up. I'll do a little. Start playing with the phone.
Okay, so right now, your device is showing on the screen.
Okay.
And let me close this other window, which is going to be nothing distracting. Okay, audio's all the way up.
What do you have your computer plugged into? The tape box.
Yeah. See what your
field. 0 of 6 values entered.
Okay, so we're going to disconnect that. Okay. Sam, you're on.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. It's great to be just in time for the warm tropical weather, and I'm really glad to be here and glad to be attending my first Accessibility Chicago meetup and digital accessibility and inclusive design. So I work for a company called Level Access out in Virginia. I grew up in the Chicago area years ago to work for Level Access. We used to be called SSB Bark Group. We do digital accessibility consulting. That includes testing, audits. We also do training. We do policy, standards, and process work, and really anything that falls under the umbrella of helping organizations to make their technology more accessible. So today, I'm going to be talking about the mobile screen readers for iOS and Android and how they work, and give an introduction to how to use them.
Just so you know, your device is not, I just see a black box. I'm not seeing the actual. Did it go to sleep?
Yes.
Okay.
Let's just make sure we still have audio.
80% charged.
Okay.
There we go.
Haskell field.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm not going to start
Okay.
demonstrating with the phone right away because I want to explain how these screen readers work. So before the stream started, Dennis mentioned that he had locked himself out of his own phone when he turned on the screen reader. And so the reason that happened is because when you turn the screen reader on, the way you interact with your phone changes. And what I mean by that is that the gestures that you use with your phone change. They do different things. And so if you don't know those gestures and you don't know how to operate the screen reader, then you might have some difficulty using your mobile device. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is some of the gestures, how to operate those screen readers built into your mobile devices, and what you can do. So what do I mean by the gestures change? The screen readers built into Apple products which run iOS and to Google products which run Android, they have some common features to them. And so one common feature is the way that you navigate the screen. And so there are essentially two different ways that you can navigate the screen, and I'll be demonstrating this as I show the different screen readers. So one method is called direct touch or explore by touch. And so what that means is that when you place your finger on an element on the screen, then the screen reader will speak what's underneath your finger. So this is a common method. If you know where something is on the screen or you want to get an idea of the layout of the screen, you can basically drag your finger around on the screen and you can hear what's underneath your finger. So for example, on the iPhone, you have icons on the bottom, the dock of the phone, right? You have your messages on the bottom left, you have your phone on the bottom right, etc. And if you always know where those icons are, it's very easy to just touch that spot on the screen until you hear that icon being spoken and then activate it. Now, what if you don't know where something is on the screen? There is another method for navigating the screen interface. And so that we can call sequential navigation. What that means is that you would basically navigate the elements in the screen in a sequential order. So if you're using a desktop environment like Windows or Mac, Many of you know that if you're using a keyboard, you can tab through, a web page or a dialog box or a window and basically encounter all of the objects in that window in a sequence, right? And so it's a very similar concept on the mobile platform. You can swipe your finger from left to right, and that will sequentially navigate all the objects on the screen. And so that's very helpful if you don't know where something is or if you want to read things in order. That's why, the reading sequence and reading order is important. And it's happened to me many times that I've been looking for something on the screen and I'll drag my finger around and I can't find it, maybe because the touch target size is too small, or maybe because, it's off the screen, right? And so I'll just keep swiping through all of the elements on the screen until I hit it. So that's a very good way to find what you're looking for if you don't know where it is. So let's talk about another concept with mobile screen readers, and that is, how do we make a touchscreen accessible non-visually? Well, if you think about how you would use a touchscreen if you are looking at the screen, what would you do? You would see where the item is on the screen, you would put your finger on it, and then hopefully it would activate when you lift your finger, right? But what if you don't know what's on the screen? So what the manufacturers, Apple and Google, have done is they've basically separated the selection and the activation process. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when you touch an item on the screen, you'll hear it, and then that item will have focus, as we call it, in the technical or the developer world, right? So you're basically selecting that item. But when you lift your finger, that doesn't activate the item, because what if that wasn't the item that you wanted, right? So you wouldn't want to activate every item that you touch on the screen, to find the one that you want. So what they've done is they've separated the gestures out. So you have one gesture to select or focus an item on the screen. Then you have a separate gesture to activate the item on the screen. So when you do a single tap on an item or you swipe to an item, that will select the item or make it have focus. And then when you do a double tap anywhere on the screen, once that item has focus, that will then activate the item that you focused. And the key with that is that you don't then have to place your finger directly on the target, right? Once you've focused it, you can double tap anywhere on screen. So you don't have to worry about then getting your finger right to that exact same spot in order to activate it. So those are some general concepts that I wanted to go over in terms of how to use a touch screen on a mobile device. Are there any questions on any of that I've covered so far?
Just go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions, and we'll relay those. Okay, go ahead, Sam.
All right, great. So now we're actually going to see it in action. So I'm going to start off with the iPhone, or iOS, which is the operating system made by Apple, contained in all of your Apple products, your mobile products, your iPhone, your iPods, touches, your iPads, etc. So the screen reader built into iOS is called VoiceOver. And VoiceOver has been around for quite a while now, since 2009, since like the iPhone 3S or 3GS. And so pretty much any Apple product you buy today is going to have VoiceOver. In fact, they even have a version for the desktop for macOS. You have the same screen reader. So VoiceOver is pretty much built into every product today. It's even built into the Apple TV. So you can use VoiceOver with the Apple TV. So what we're going to do is look at VoiceOver and look at how to use it. So the first question is, how do you turn VoiceOver on, right? Because you need to be able to do that. So I'm going to show you the path for turning on VoiceOver, and then I'm going to show you some shortcuts that you can use. So let's see if my phone comes on here.
6:38 p.m.
There we go.
Utilities folder. 8 apps. 2 new items.
Okay.
Double tap to open.
So I did slow my speech rate down because this is not the speech rate that I listen to my phone at. But is this too fast for people? Do you want me to slow it down more?
Okay, yes, there's a
No,
question.
actually, at some point, could you demonstrate the speed you would normally use it at?
Yeah, we'll do that at the end or something.
Thank you.
Okay. So one thing I quickly want to show, let me quickly show what I was talking about in terms of the different methods of navigation. So one thing you'll notice is that I mentioned this concept of focus, right? VoiceOver has a cursor which is represented, I believe, by a black rectangle, and you'll see that around anything that has focus. So if I start touching items on my screen,
Radio folder. 8 apps. 1 new item. Double tap to
Okay,
open.
so now the
Actions available.
radio folder has focus, right? And you can see the outline around that. And so now I don't have to touch in that exact same spot in order to activate or open that folder, right? I can double tap, or I can even split tap, which means tapping with 2 different fingers, anywhere on the screen, and it will open once I've set focus to it. So let's go back into our utilities folder, which is
Utilities folder.
there it is.
8 apps. 2 new items. Opening utilities folder. Utilities.
And that's
Heading.
where I've
Text
placed my
field.
settings app. So
Double tap and hold to start edit mode.
We'll find my settings app.
Settings.
There it is.
Double tap to settings.
Now, inside settings, we want to go to our general settings.
General. 1 update available. Button. Selected. General. Settings. Back button.
And if you want to play along, you're more than welcome to do so. Just if you're in the room, keep the volume of your phone at a respectful level of your neighbors. All right, so now we're going to go to
About. Software update. About.
accessibility.
Accessibility.
There's
Button.
accessibility.
Selected. Accessibility. General. Back button.
And then here
Vision.
is,
Heading.
under vision, we have voiceover.
VoiceOver. On. Button.
So if we
VoiceOver. VoiceOver.
that.
Accessibility. Back button. VoiceOver. VoiceOver. On. Double tap to toggle setting.
You can see this switch here is set to the on position. If I were to turn it off, then it would, actually I can go ahead and do that.
Off. Alert. Important. Are you sure you want to disable VoiceOver? Cancel. Button. OK. Button. OK. VoiceOver off.
Okay, so now you can see how the switch changes color and it's in a different position when VoiceOver is on. Now I have a little secret shortcut to turn VoiceOver back on.
VoiceOver. Settings. Utilities. Heading. Text field.
And I press
Calendar.
too many times.
Thursday. Settings.
So let's go back here.
Set. VoiceOver. On.
Okay,
Double tap to toggle setting.
so VoiceOver is on. Now VoiceOver has a practice mode.
VoiceOver speaks items on the screen. Tap once to select an item. Double tap to activate the selected item. Swipe 3 fingers to scroll. VoiceOver practice. Button. Selected. VoiceOver practice. Heading.
So this is a great thing to go into if you want to learn the gestures for using VoiceOver. It's a great way to learn them, get feedback on what they do without breaking your phone.
Done. Button. Practice VoiceOver gestures, commands, and typing in this area. Select the Done button in the top right corner and double tap to exit. Flick right. Move to next item.
Okay, so you can hear that it's now telling us what these gestures do, right? So it's at flick right, move to next item.
Touch. Select item under your finger.
And if I start dragging my finger around, it says touch, select item under your finger, right? So this is a great way to get feedback. Many desktop screen readers have a very similar mode, right? It's a keyboard help mode that you turn on, and basically you can give the keyboard commands and they will tell you what they do. One other thing I do want to mention about both VoiceOver and TalkBack, which is on Android, is that you can pair a keyboard to your phone, and you can also pair a refreshable braille display to your phone. And so you can control these screen readers using a keyboard or a refreshable braille display. So you don't have to use these gestures, but if you don't have one of those things, then you would use the gestures, and then you could just use the touchscreen of your phone. So Apple was really pretty innovative when they came up with a way for somebody to non-visually use a completely smooth glass surface, right, and be able to operate the phone without any tactile indicators to know where you are or what you're doing. And they came up with these paradigms to allow you to locate items, to focus them, and then to activate them. So let's look at a couple of other gestures that you can do. Now, what if you want to, let's say, read the screen? So let's try doing a 2-finger swipe down from the top.
2-finger flick down. Read page starting at selected item.
Okay, so that'll read the page starting wherever your focus is, right? Wherever you're located on the screen, it will start reading from that point. Now, what if you want to scroll the screen? If we want to scroll the screen up, we actually do a 3-finger swipe up from the bottom of the screen.
3-finger flick up. Scroll down 1 page.
Okay, and so if you're on a web page or something, you're trying, you know how you would normally scroll the page down, maybe, what is the gesture without VoiceOver running? I think it's a 1-finger swipe up, something like that. the equivalent is to do a 3-finger swipe down from the bottom of the screen, and it will scroll up. Now, if you want to scroll horizontally, you want to scroll to the next page, you would do a 3-finger swipe to the left.
3-finger flick left. Scroll right 1 page.
Okay. Now, one other thing I should point out is that if you want to navigate in reverse for any of these gestures, you would simply do these gestures in reverse, right? So if I want to go 1 page backwards, then I would do a 3-finger swipe from the left to the right.
3-finger flick right. Scroll left 1 page.
Right. If I want to scroll the screen up, I'm reading something, and then I want to move back up to the top, I can do a 3-finger swipe down from the top of the screen.
3-finger flick down. Scroll up 1 page.
And that also goes for navigating items sequentially, right? So I mentioned, you can do a 1-finger swipe to the right.
Flick right. Move to next item.
Right. And then you can do a 1-finger flick to the left. Maybe you want to navigate in reverse and go the other way.
Flick left. Move to previous item.
Right. Okay. So let me also show you so let's look at the double tap first, right? So let's say that I have something focused on the screen.
Touch. Select item under your finger.
Let's pretend that that's focused, right? And then I want to activate it. So I would do a double tap.
Double tap. Activates the selected item.
Right. And that then invokes or activates whatever had focus. Now, I don't necessarily have to use the same finger. I can actually keep 1 finger on the screen and then use a 2nd finger, and that basically simulates the double tap. So if I have difficulty doing the double tap, let's see if I can find this done button on the top right.
Done. Orientation locked. Done. Button.
Okay. So now it's focused. Now I don't have to hit that same spot on the screen, right? Because it's focused, the rectangles around it. So I can put 1 finger on the screen, and then I can put another finger on the screen.
Touch. Split tap. Activates the selected item.
Okay, well.
Done. Touch. Select item. Practice voice over gestures. Done. Practice voice over gestures. Done. Button.
Okay, there it is.
Practice voice over gestures.
Okay, so
Commands.
it's a little
Done.
difficult
Button.
to do with the split tap, so I'll double tap it.
Done.
There we go.
VoiceOver. VoiceOver practice. Button.
Now let's see if I can split tap this.
Practice voice.
There we go. Okay. So you saw how I kept 1 finger on the screen, and then I used it. I tapped with a 2nd finger on my other hand. Okay, so that's how I did that. So up to this point, are there any questions on the gestures or how you navigate the screen?
Yes, we have one.
All right. Okay. So up in my status bar.
Oh, well, let's just repeat what the question was.
Yes.
So the question was about orientation frozen.
Yes. So she asked why it announced that the orientation was frozen. So up in my
100% battery power. Look. Done. Button. Done. VoiceOver. VoiceOver practice.
Up
Button.
in my status bar, it says
location. Look. Orientate 9:41 a.m. Orientation locked. Status bar item. Swipe down with 3 fingers to reveal the notification center. Swipe up with 3 fingers to reveal the control center. Double tap to scroll to top.
I think it says 9:41 because I put it in airplane mode so that no one can bother me. I have locked the orientation of my screen. That was a choice that I made, and the reason I did that is obviously if you rotate the phone, and this isn't a voiceover specific thing, right? This is something you do in the control center. If you rotate the phone, 90 degrees, right, and you put it in landscape mode, then your phone, the orientation of your phone changes, right? And so then you have to the way you do the gestures change, right? So instead of swiping from across the short end of the phone, I would have to swipe across the lengthwise. And so I prefer to use the phone in portrait mode, and I don't want it to flip on me. So I just locked the orientation of the screen so that it doesn't do that. That's not something that you have to do. In fact, if you don't do that, and there are some apps like GarageBand, I think there's some apps that will actually force the orientation of your screen into a different mode, like landscape mode. And so when the screen rotates into a different position, then VoiceOver will announce that, and it will actually tell you, if you go into landscape mode where you have your phone sideways, then it will tell you whether the home button is to the left or the right, and that way you know which way the phone is facing. All right, great. So we don't have a lot of time left for VoiceOver, so let me show you a few more things. Another thing I'm going to show you is something called the rotor. Now, the rotor controls many settings on VoiceOver, but it also controls your units of navigation. So let's say you don't want to go one element at a time, right? You want to know how something's spelled, for example. What you can do is use the rotor to tell it to navigate by character or by word or by line, etc. And that will give you, you can also use it to navigate by structural elements such as headings, links, form fields, etc., depending on where you are, whether you're on a website or in a native mobile app. And so that's a reason to place structural elements within your apps, right? Because they can actually be used for navigation. So how do you do the rotor gesture with VoiceOver? Well, it requires basically a rotating gesture, and that means that you move one finger up and you move the other finger down. So
Screen dimmed.
Let me do that quickly.
Look. Characters.
Okay, I had to do that before my screen locked. You heard it say characters. Now if I keep twisting the rotor,
Words.
now it's set to words.
Speaking rate.
Speaking rate.
Headings.
Headings.
Vertical navigation. Containers. Audio ducking. Language. Actions. Characters.
Okay, so those are options that are available where I am now. If I was, let's say, inside a web page, I would have more options like links, etc. And then also within the VoiceOver settings, you can actually control what shows up in the rotor. You don't have to use the same hand. I had a very difficult time performing that gesture with one hand. I used to use two hands.
Words.
And you basically do the same gesture. You move one finger up and one finger down. Or you can spin it in reverse. If you do one finger down, one finger up. See, that's harder for me to do with two hands now.
Characters.
There we go. Now we're back to characters. Now, the way you actually navigate by that unit, instead of flicking or swiping from left to right, you actually swipe up and down. So if I want to spell something, I can start swiping down the screen.
Cap S. B. T. T. I. N. G. S.
Okay, so I guess that's at settings, right? So I can switch to words.
Words. Settings.
Let's find something else here.
Yacht o'clock.
Oh, let's go
Double
back
settings.
to settings.
Double tap. Settings. VoiceOver practice. Button.
Okay, so let's see what words that is.
Speaking rate.
We'll go to words.
Words. VoiceOver. Practice.
And it's navigating now by words. So the key with VoiceOver here is that if you swipe from left to right,
Speaking rate. Heading.
you're always going to jump to the next object or element on the screen, right? And if you want to have a more granular navigation, then you then do the swipe up and down.
Speaking. Rate. Rate. Speaking.
And then if I want to spell that, I would switch the rotor back to characters.
Characters. Cap S. Cap P. Cap E. Cap A. Cap K. Cap I.
Etc. Okay.
India.
So somebody wanted to know what my standard speaking rate is. I generally have it set around 90%, so let's set it there.
Words. Speaking rate. 65%. 70%. 75%. 80%. 85%. 90%.
That's about good, right?
Speaking rate. 90%. Boost pitch change. On. Verbosity. Button.
Right. So probably a number of folks can understand VoiceOver at that speed. Did you understand that all right, Alan, at 90%? Yeah, I figured. All right. So yeah. So once you get, if you listen to text to speech for a long time, it's basically a matter of training your ears, right? And if you consider that, this is often a form of reading, right? This is how people consume information non-visually. People tend not to read at the same rate that they talk, right? So you generally want to be able to read faster, and so you train your ears to understand that faster rate of speech. I think we probably need to wrap up the VoiceOver section, so I want to open it up for questions at this time.
Any questions about VoiceOver screen reader? Yes.
I have a question. So when you were reading through the text and it was all caps,
Mm-hmm.
does it always read like that when you have all capitalized letters? Does it actually read the full text together?
Okay, so the question was, when a letter is capitalized, does VoiceOver always read the capitalized letter, or does it read the text together? So I think what you're asking me is about the navigation. So the reason it was saying capital before each letter is because I was navigating by character, right? And so it was identifying the uppercase letters from the lowercase letters. But if you have the rotor set to words, then it's not going to, it's not going to say that something's capitalized. It's just going to announce the word. Does that answer your question?
It does. I asked because on the desktop, I know some screen readers will read alt like
Yeah.
And I was wondering if it does the same thing. In VoiceOver.
Okay. So the follow-up comment that was made was that on desktop screen readers, often if you have words that are basically written together like a hashtag or maybe a variable if you're programming, and you don't capitalize the first letter of each word, that everything will be pronounced as if it's a single word, right? But if you capitalize the first letter of each word, then even though there are no spaces in between the words, each the capital letter will basically be used as a delimiter or a breaking point to indicate where the next word starts, and so they'll be pronounced as separate words. So that is a good reason to, if you're writing words without spaces in them, that is a good reason to capitalize the first letter of each word, right? Because I believe VoiceOver does, like if I were to write Merry Christmas and capitalize the M and the C, then it should read Merry Christmas. It shouldn't, try to pronounce that as a single word.
And just, of course, this question always allows me to tell the story of if you have a website that uses the acronym FAQs, you're going to be swearing at your audience. So if you want to check it out on your screen readers now, go ahead. Yes, Alan? They have.
They do it now. They're gonna get fat.
Okay, on JAWS, or is that like?
Well, I get it on both.
Okay.
Website one now, I get fat.
Okay.
Yeah, a lot of these screen readers, they will now have pronunciation dictionary. So they'll program words like FAQ directly, as an entry when the screen reader ships, so that it pronounces it correctly. And then what the pronunciation dictionary allows you to do is basically specify when you see a word written a certain way, then pronounce it as an alternate spelling so that it's pronounced a particular way.
Sam, just so you know, someone on the YouTube chat just asked, what version of iOS are you using, 10.33 or 11?
Okay, so the question is, what version of iOS am I using? Right now, so we're using my personal device, which is why I turned off the notifications. I went into airplane mode. And so on my phone, I currently have 10.3.3 installed. And the reason for that is because I still have some 32-bit apps on my phone that I use. So if I upgraded to iOS 11, then I could only use the 64-bit apps. So that's more of a personal situation right now. Certainly when we do testing, for clients, et cetera, professionally, we'll use iOS 11. Once it becomes more stable and widely adopted in the market. So at this point in time, we would be more likely to test with iOS 11 than we would, let's say, 3 months ago when it first came out.
Okay, and now go ahead and ask your question. While you do now, we're going to start switching over to Android. So.
Okay, real quickly, going back to that question about capitalization, you use the example of a capital first letter, but if Merry Christmas and all the letters are capitalized, two separate words, Merry Christmas, all cap letters, both words, how will the screen reader read that? Will it stop for each letter and say letter, or will it read the actual word?
Okay, so the question was about screen reader pronunciation. The question was, if you were to write a word in all caps without putting any spaces in between the words.
With space in between.
With words, with space. Okay, so a word that's written in all caps is generally going to, again, this depends on the screen reader and the pronunciation rules. And it can also depend on the particular voice or the text-to-speech engine that the user has selected. But generally, if you write words in all uppercase, then they will generally be read as actual, as whole words, unless the screen reader recognizes it as abbreviation. So like Alan was saying earlier with FAQ, they're starting to program the screen reader to recognize FAQ is an abbreviation, it's not a word. You should read it as FAQ and not try to pronounce it as a word. So generally the uppercase rules will apply. The rules that apply to lowercase words will also apply to uppercase, but also the intelligence is built in sometimes for screen readers to recognize that if a word is written in all uppercase, it might be an acronym. And so if it recognizes that acronym, then it might try to spell it out.
Does punctuation help it recognize the difference between acronyms and like periods between each word and difference between acronyms and actual words?
Okay, so the question was, if you place punctuation in between letters in an all caps word, will that help with the pronunciation? That's certainly going to break up the pronunciation of the word, right? So if I were to write, A.K.A, right? It's going to say AKA, and then depending on the verbosity level that I have my punctuation set to, it'll either pronounce the periods or not pronounce the periods. But the periods let it know to basically break that word up, right? It's not a single word because there are punctuation marks in between the letters, so it's not going to try to pronounce that as a single word.
Talk back on. Talk back.
Okay.
All right.
It's gonna say Aka.
Echo.
Okay, so Sam, can't believe it, but
Involve-
I got TalkBack working now. What I'm going to do is shut it off.
involved in it.
Okay.
So this way you can show how to
Tapping
turn it
OK,
on.
OK button. Double
Okay, and I have you right now on the settings screen. Is that okay, or did you want me to put it back to the home screen?
Did you say that TalkBack is turned off?
Right now it's turned off. Did you want me to turn it on? I didn't know if you wanted to show that or not.
Let's start with it turned on because that's how
Okay.
that's how I had
Okay.
that's how I had VoiceOver. And I don't know if you have your accessibility shortcut set up.
I probably don't.
talk back on. Talk
Okay.
back.
Okay. Here's my phone.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about what if you're on Android. And so if you're on Android, which is the operating system made by Google on various phones, the screen reader built into Android is called TalkBack. And so again, TalkBack works very similar to VoiceOver, right? So I can drag my finger around on the screen.
When talkback is on, your device provides spoken feedback to help blind and low vision users.
And I
For
can,
example, it describes what you touch, select, and activate. If you have turned talkback on accidentally, turn it off by tapping the switch until the green outline is around it, then double
okay,
tap
so
it.
that nice long paragraph
Use the statement.
is now focused, right? So that has focus. And so now I can either touch anywhere on the screen and anything that is under my finger will be spoken,
Talkback is on, your
or I can flick left and right.
characters, words.
Is this in,
Switch mode from landscape, portrait to
see,
landscape.
he doesn't have his phone, he doesn't have his orientation locked.
Your device
Right.
Want me to lock it?
provides
No, I don't.
feedback
Okay.
to help blind and low
Okay, so now,
My wife actually gets on me about
Default.
that.
okay. Okay, so now I can swipe left and right.
Switch. Double, when talkback is on. Navigate up button. Talkback. Settings button.
Okay.
Double tap to activate. Double
So
tap
very
to
similarly,
go to
right, when I
long
swipe left and right, then something has, I can navigate sequentially, right? And then that item will have focus, and I would do a double tap to activate. So I'm going to go into the TalkBack settings here,
Talkback settings.
and I'm going to look for a setting, which
Talkback
should be very
settings.
helpful.
Version speech bulk text to verbosity. Use proximate shape to other feedback. Vibration feed, sound feedback. Focus speech. Sound volume. Touch exploration. Explore by automatically single tap act. Show context. Launch talkback gestures. Launch talkback tutorial. Gestures.
Okay, so
Landscape.
Um,
Talkback settings.
TalkBack has a tutorial, which I'm not going to show, but it's very similar in purpose to the VoiceOver practice. It basically guides you through using Explore by Touch. One other thing that difference between VoiceOver and TalkBack is that you can actually turn Explore by Touch off for some reason in TalkBack, which means that when you drag your finger around on the screen, it's not going to speak what's under your finger. So you generally want to make sure that's on. It usually is on by default, but if it's not announcing what's under your finger, you want to check that Explore by Touch setting and make sure that it's on. Now let's see if I can find the setting I was looking for here.
Text to speech settings. Characters. Words.
Oh, I forgot that.
Coordinates.
There we go.
Talkback settings.
Portrait.
Sound volume, 50 characters. Default.
There we go.
Object. Long select keyboard shortcut. Talkback suspend and resume in screen. When talkback in screen short, resume from suspect. Show open talkback at developer settings.
Okay, so there's something here called developer settings. Let's go in here.
Developer settings. Developer settings. Developer settings. Log output level. Display speech output off. Switch.
Okay, display
Double tap
speech
to
output.
activate.
So let's turn that on.
On.
Oh, this
Show
is like,
items 1 to
oh my
5 of
God.
5.
I love it.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So this is a nice feature
Sam, you
for.
just made my year.
This is why I came, so that Dennis could learn about this feature. This should also make the captioning a little easier too.
Right.
So for those who didn't follow what happened is I went into the developer settings, and in there's a setting called show speech output. And what that does is it visually shows on the screen anything that TalkBack is saying. Okay. So this is kind of similar to the speech viewer in NVDA on Windows, where you can actually see on the screen what TalkBack is saying. So that's obviously very useful. Now let's
Log output level error.
see if we can
Developer
get back
settings
up.
out of the 5 notification. Stop developer settings. Log output level. Log display speech
Well,
output.
See if I can find the back button.
Landscape. Talkback settings. Portrait.
Okay.
Talkback settings. Touch exploration. Header.
All right. Well, we did end up going back somehow.
Verbosity. Text to speech settings. Speech volume. Match medium speech. Header. Version 5.2. Talkback. Version 5 speech header in list 30. Touch exploration.
Well, anyway,
header.
what I want to show is what I showed similarly on the iPhone in terms of how you can navigate by units. Now, with VoiceOver, remember that every time we swipe left and right with a finger, that would allow us to basically move to the next or previous object on the screen, and that was very consistent. The difference with TalkBack is that you can actually change what the swipe left and right does. So the way I changed that, instead of using that rotor gesture that I used on the iPhone, I basically swipe up and down.
Characters.
So now it's set to character. So now when I swipe to the right,
Capital T. Tango.
it's navigating by character.
U C H.
Right? Okay, so I can navigate by words.
Word. Exploration. Exploration.
So if you find that your swipe left and right are not moving by the correct element, then you want to make sure that it's set to default. So if I want to go back to default, I'll do a swipe up from the bottom of the screen.
Characters.
The other thing I should mention about TalkBack is that all of the gestures use one finger.
Default.
And they do have multi-part gestures where you might move your finger. Basically, they're two-part gestures, but you're always doing them with a single finger. If you add another finger, then that gesture gets passed through to the application. So, for example, if I do a two-finger swipe to the left.
Landscape.
Oh.
Talkback settings. Portrait.
All right, let's do a two-finger swipe up.
Showing items 6 to 18 of 30.
Right, so that scrolled the screen, right? Why? Because if I had done a single finger swipe up without TalkBack running, then it would scroll the screen. But because I added that extra finger to TalkBack, it passed that gesture through. It would be like doing a single finger swipe up if TalkBack wasn't running. Does that make sense? Okay, so any questions up to this point?
Okay, continue. Oh, sorry.
Do you find that the Android, one or the other, is easier to use?
Okay, so basically the question is, what's easier to use, TalkBack or VoiceOver? Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I've certainly used VoiceOver a lot more than I use TalkBack, and if Dennis had mentioned the WebAIM screen reader survey earlier. If you look at the statistics from that, you'll find that there's a much higher percentage of blind people using iPhones than there are Android, and it's very skewed from the mainstream population, right? If you look at mainstream statistics, Android usage tends to surpass iPhone usage. But the reason that you have more blind people using iPhone, there are a couple of reasons for that. For one thing, VoiceOver, it's been around for a very long time. It's very mature in terms of its feature set. It's very mature in terms of its accessibility support. And I think generally apps tend to be more accessible on iOS than they do on Android. Do you find that to be the case, Alan?
I do. And I think part of the reason too is that, when sighted people, you have a choice based on the fact they just simply have choices. I think blind people primarily choose because of accessibility. And so, not really, in my opinion, not much of a choice. If you really want to have accessibility, you're gonna go with iPhone or Android.
Sure. So basically, what
There's
out?
another part to that I
Okay.
would like to add.
Sure.
Up until recently, the Apple Store, along with its staff, was not only trained in accessibility, but offered either for cost or for free certain seminars and lectures, group seminars, an individual one-on-one that you could pay for, so that you could actually learn how to use all the accessibility features and do more and more things. So that you had your private, you had an individual tutor, you had somebody you could go to and say, how do I make this happen? How do I do this? And you had that kind of personal support on site at the Apple Store. And that, I often find, has a huge impact on the people's choice of choosing to use iOS over Android.
Okay, so there were essentially 2 points that were made. The first one was that blind people will generally go with the more accessible option, or if it's a case of accessible versus not accessible, then sometimes you don't have a choice, right? You have to choose the more accessible. You have to choose.
Showing off TalkBack for Android. Number 11, HTT's
I think we have a tweet coming in or something like that. All right. So yeah. So if you have an app that's accessible on iOS and it's not accessible on Android, well then what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You know, you have to go with the accessible option, right? You don't really have a choice. The other comment was made was that essentially the support and the training tends to be better, or there tends to be more training available on iOS, because oftentimes the Apple Store employees, if you go into an Apple Store, you can get training from an employee.
And is now following you.
And you might get, we're getting all the tweeted. This is why I went into airplane mode on my own phone, right? But that, you know, you can hear that TalkBack is announcing the notifications, and that's the same thing for iOS. And so I wasn't going to get into too much of a technical discussion. This was more an introduction to how to operate the screen reader. Certainly at Level Access, we advise developers and organizations on how to actually make their apps accessible and what they need to do. But you can hear that these notifications are being announced by TalkBack, and they are also announced on the iPhone by VoiceOver. And so what that requires is that you post the notification properly, right? If you post it, you know, in a way using the standard methods that allows the assistive technologies to know that an event has occurred, then they can then announce that event. It's basically an alert gets fired, and they know what to announce. Are there other questions?
Actually, Sam, there's one question. It's not about VoiceOver. It's mobile software in general. Scott Binkel from the stream asks, is it safe to assume folks are always on the latest mobile software? Do we need to test on older versions of mobile devices when it comes to accessibility? Okay,
so the question is basically, is it safe to assume that folks are on the latest versions of mobile software, or should you test with older versions? That's a great question, and certainly in the Android world is a lot more fragmented than the iOS world, right? Android is open source. That's another point that I should mention about Android, is that, you know, you have multiple phone manufacturers for Android devices, right? Apple controls the hardware. Well, you know, you're only going to get iOS on an Apple product. You're not going to get it on anything else. It's all Apple hardware. They've got everything tied together. On Android, you know, Android can be used by any phone manufacturer, and they can modify it. And so oftentimes they do modify it, and they'll add or remove or change settings. And so the features that you have available on TalkBack may not be available across devices. You may not have the same features available. Even with TalkBack, TalkBack is not tied to the operating system. You can go into the Play Store and you can download newer versions of TalkBack, or you can install betas of TalkBack and not affect the version of Android that you're using. So in terms of how we handle the version issue in the professional setting, is that, you know, we tend to test with close to the latest version. You know, we try to test things as standardly as possible. Obviously, you're going to have improvements in the accessibility frameworks, you know, between versions, and so something that may not be as accessible on an older version of a platform may be more accessible on a later version if they've implemented features, or they may have implemented features, because on iOS you have special gestures that you can use. There's a gesture called the magic tap, which is the 2-finger double tap, and that's used to, play and pause things. It's used to answer and hang up calls, and it can be used. You can actually invoke that gesture in your app to perform different actions. So, like Facebook and Twitter, for example, they have each story or each news item in your timeline is a single swipe, and then if you want to react or interact with that story, then you can do the 2-finger double tap. That will bring up a menu of options that you can perform on that particular story. So if you were using a version of iOS that didn't support that gesture, then obviously that you would be able to test that feature. So we will test, depending on the amount of time, et cetera, that we have to work on a project. We'll test very close to the latest version. We're not going to test within a month of release, right? We'll wait at least a month, maybe a few months. And so like Oreo right now for Android, right? Android 8. That's going to have a much lower usage, within the population in general, and probably with the blind community. So we might test one version back. We might test Android 7, until Oreo achieves wider adoption. So we really do try to look at the market, and we try to look at what's the most common scenario. And also when testing with Android, we try to use as vanilla of a configuration as possible, because, for example, like I said, you have these phone manufacturers who can make modifications. They could modify TalkBack or make other modifications to the framework or the platform that could have an impact on accessibility. So we do tend to test with vanilla Google devices like a Nexus or a Pixel, something like that. Samsung actually has their own screen reader called Voice Assist, and it's basically a forked version of TalkBack.
You have 6 minutes.
Okay, so I have 6 minutes left. In terms of using TalkBack, and it's very similar. I did want to mention one other thing in terms of browser support. On the iPhone, you do have Safari, and pretty much every browser on the iPhone is using the Safari engine. So you're going to get the same experience no matter what browser you're using on the iPhone. With Android, you can use Chrome, or you can use Firefox, or maybe even another browser. But Chrome and Firefox are really going to be the only 2 browsers that are going to have any decent level of accessibility support. And the level of support is going to vary, between browsers, and also between versions of browsers. So you have a lot of moving parts, right? You have a lot of things to consider in terms of, what's more accessible, Chrome versus Safari, or Chrome versus Firefox, I'm sorry, on Android. That's been changing, because we originally saw that Firefox had a greater accessibility support. So for example, you could do more navigation. You could navigate by headings. You could navigate by all of these different structural elements. But then we started running into issues with later versions of Firefox. They were basically compatibility issues with TalkBack, where for example, you couldn't even activate a link. And so there are certain versions of Firefox that have some compatibility issues with TalkBack. And so one thing that I've provided is a list of resources, which we're going to put up on the slides here in a few minutes. And then they're also going to be on the meetup page. And so one page I have there is basically a browser and assistive technology matrix. And it will show you, which browsers work the best with which platforms and screen readers, and what the issues are with particular versions of browsers. And that's a matrix put out by the company that I work for, Level Access. So I did want to bring that to your attention. What else would people like to see on TalkBack? One thing I didn't show is typing. Oh, sure. Okay.
7:18 p.m. Charging 9.4%. About 35 minutes until fully charged. Make sure that your finger covers the entire home key. No. Charging. 9 screen off. Device unlocked. TalkBack settings.
So let's get back to,
Install ID and showing off TalkBack for Android. Then launch TalkBack gestures. Double tap to activate. Launch TalkBack.
see if I
with
can
the
get back
gesture.
to the home screen.
Gesture.
Oh, does this have a home button on it? Oh, look at that.
Yeah, there you go.
Home.
Oh, so then, you know, this is that's a special feature of this Android device, right? It's that it actually has a physical home button that I was able to hit.
This is a Note 5, by the way, so it's an old device.
So many Android phones don't actually have a physical home button. You basically have to you know, feel around towards the bottom center of the screen and look for that. But there was actually a tactile home button that I could hit and feel. And now let's see if we can go to the apps here.
Message plus. Double phone. Message plus. Double apps button. Double
Okay,
tap.
so let's go to the apps
Page
here.
4 of 4. What other line? Double tap to activate. Double tap and hold to long press. World weather line. VIP access. Left up edge. Double tap YouTube. Yelp. WordPress.
Okay, so we're
Video. Double
pretty far down in here.
weather line. Double scissor. Yep. Video. YouTuber. Time. Third edge. Double weather line. Double tap to page 3 of security and privacy. One new page map. Double tap meetup. Messenger. One new item. Time rhyme.
Where's the mess?
Map. List.
You're
Meetup.
looking.
I was just looking for to bring up a keyboard so I can show how to type.
Oh.
So what would be a good? I don't want to.
An email.
Yeah, just let's go into email.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Messenger.
Oh,
One
that's
new
right.
item. Double tap to activate.
One
Double
second.
tap and hold to long press. Suspend.
Hold on one
Okay.
second.
Button. TalkBack suspended.
It'll be faster for me.
Yeah.
Hey, get rid of that.
Sam, does Android have a dictate
TalkBack
function?
resume. Compose.
The question is, does Android have a dictate function?
Compose.
Yes, there are. As part of the Google keyboard, you can
Oh, okay.
dictate. Okay. So we have an on-screen keyboard up where we should.
Yeah, you're actually in an email in the message area.
Okay. So let's pretend we're sending an email to a support address, right? So I want to find the S. So the keyboard, it's a standard QWERTY keyboard, right? So I should know the general layout. I should be able to find the S, near the bottom left of the screen somewhere.
R. E. S.
And as soon as I lift my finger,
E. S.
okay, so apparently this is not set to the touch typing setting, whatever that setting is in TalkBack. So I have to double tap here.
E. X. E. S.
Is it going through?
Y.
So again, it's a case to where you're putting focus on the key and then you're double tapping to actually invoke it.
Yes, but there is a setting in TalkBack, which I need to find, but we won't do it tonight because it's going to take too long.
Especially on mine.
Press Alt plus Shift plus Enter to long press.
Let me,
Touch typing is easier.
yeah. So I was going to show this on the iPhone and I ran out of time, but there's a setting called touch typing. What that means is that you can basically lift your finger and it will put the letter in there as soon as you lift your finger. And so the reason they allow that, for the keyboard, even though it's not, allowed other places on the phone, is because if you had to find a letter and then double tap it, can you imagine how long it would take even just to write a text message? That would take a very long time, right? So there's this touch typing mode, which basically, when you lift your finger, then it will insert that letter. So it's very similar to how you would use a phone if you didn't have a screen reader running, right? You would touch the letter. Once you located it, you drag your finger around on the screen until you found the letter. Once you found it, you would lift your finger off the screen, and then it would put it in. It would enter it in. So that's a screen reader setting on VoiceOver and TalkBack. And if you're implementing a keyboard in your app, a custom keyboard, you want to make sure that keyboard is actually going to honor whatever the user has that their setting set to. So, for example, we do work with, we've done testing for like telecommunications manufacturers, cable manufacturers who may have like their own dial pad. Maybe they have an app where you can make phone calls, etc. And so one thing I'll test with that is I'll test their keypad, see if it behaves the way it does on the phone. That's what I should have done, is I should have brought up the phone. try dialing a number. And so if it doesn't activate the key when I lift my finger, then I'll flag that as an issue, right? Because it should respect the screen reader setting to actually lift your finger when you enter a letter in there. So I think we should open it up for questions at this time.
Yeah, we have about 2-3 minutes for questions. Yes.
Do you find that the screen readers are better for you on like an actual Android or iPhone app as opposed to a browser app?
Okay, so the basic question is, what is easier to use, or what is better, using a native mobile app versus like bringing up a site in a browser, or maybe even like a hybrid app that has like an embedded web view in it. And I think it's probably personal preference, but I think in many cases that native apps are a little faster to navigate. And the thing with native apps is that you have much more flexibility to really leverage and take advantage of features of the platform, right? So these special gestures that I mentioned, that you can perform, you can take advantage of all of those. You can make it a little easier to navigate, right? For example, you could place tabs at the bottom of the screen to switch screens, and then the user would then just have to drag their finger down to the bottom of the screen, find the tab that they want, activate it, and then it would switch screens. Versus, if you're on a web page, you're essentially having to sequentially swipe through the entire page, right? Because you're not going to know where something's laid out directly on the screen. You may not even know if it's in view, depending on where you are on the web page. So I do think that mobile apps, native apps, do tend to be faster in situations.
I'm going to take this question on the stream because we got to end the stream here shortly. Brian asked, a friend is researching tactile smart screens, and I'm wondering, how would a tactile smart screen change the accessibility landscape for users?
Okay, so the question is, if you had basically a tactile smart screen, I believe like an overlay, how would that change the accessibility landscape? I have seen some tactile screen protectors. There's a company, for example, called Speed Dots, and so they make a tactile screen protector. What that does is, for example, they'll place dots where the on-screen keyboard would show up, right? So if you feel those dots, they basically give you a point of reference, right? If you have a tactile point of reference, then obviously things are going to be a lot faster for you to locate on the screen than having to drag your finger around a smooth surface and then receive audible feedback as to where something is, right? In fact, I didn't switch over to the iPhone until November of 2013. And the reason for that was because I wanted to use my phone for GPS, and I'm thinking, well, if I'm walking around with a cane or with one hand occupied, and then I'm trying to operate a touchscreen to try to figure out where I am, that's going to be very difficult to do with one hand.
Message statement left.
And I was right. It is a lot slower. But eventually, I was pretty much forced to switch. And you do get a lot more accessibility on iOS and Android than you would like from a flip phone, and you do a lot more with it. But certainly, when you have tactile markers, it's going to allow you to orient yourself faster than if you didn't have them. But the problem with touchscreens, right, is that they're dynamic. So nothing is going to always be there. So then what do those markers mean when what is on the screen has changed? So that's where that issue comes in.
Okay, so first off, I'm going to stop the broadcast 1 second. We are going to take more questions, but first off, let's give Sam a nice round of applause for the demo tonight. I got to drag my cursor over here and Shazam, as they say, once I get focused there.